Settled in the late 1600s by English settler Captain John Smith, Holland Island was one of many islands up and down the east side of the Chesapeake Bay. From Kent Island in the north to Watts Island in the south, these islands became home to people from the Cornwall area of England. Their unique accents and ways of life can still be found on these islands today. By the early 1700s, Holland Island had become a small community with a few families living on it, houses, an established church, and a cemetery. At 275 acres, Holland Island was now an established community and a lovely place to live for generations to come. Families at first harvested the land in order to provide food for their families, with perhaps the occasional seafood for supper. But by the late 1700s, people living on Holland Island had become watermen and hunters, depending on the bay's abundant ecosystem of seafood and waterfowl to supply their families with food. Around the mid-1800s, Holland Island was a complete town, with a doctor, full-time minister, a school, several cemeteries, a couple of general stores, and the east and west ridge of the island was now lined with houses. One of those houses was my great-great-grandmother's, Mildred Todd. Her family was one of the first to settle on Holland Island. By the mid-1800s, Holland Island was still a small community with a self-sustaining population. That, however, changed very quickly after the Civil War, when the modern invention of the railroad came to Crisfield, Maryland, a small town on the mainland in Dorchester County, not too far from Holland Island. The new, faster way of transportation made it possible for fishermen on Holland Island to greatly profit off of what they had harvested out of the bay. This had appealed to others from around Maryland to move to Holland Island, allowing them easier access to the Chesapeake Bay, so that they could become part of the expanding business of harvesting seafood from the bay. In the blink of an eye, Holland Island's population increased dramatically. By 1900, Holland Island had approximately 60 homes and a population of 360. Holland Island quickly became the glory of the Chesapeake, with a school of 62 children, church-sponsored bike rides, and a Redman's Hall for entertainment. For a while, there was even a small confectionery shop for the little boys and girls. However, life as they knew it was about to change forever. After the turn of the century, erosion from rainfall and tides was becoming a severe problem. Graves were moved to other cemeteries on the island, and houses were moved farther inland, just to find the shoreline a short distance from their house a few years later. People began to think the unthinkable. We must leave the place we love. And beginning in 1915, they did. One by one, houses were disassembled and taken by barge to places on the mainland, such as Crisfield. By 1930, the population was zero, with a few abandoned houses still left on the island. Holland Island was no more. Instead, it was a grim reminder of what once was. The island sat in mournful silence, with a few assigned caretakers visiting and maintaining it every so often. One of those caretakers had a nephew who would occasionally play on the island while his uncle was at work. This little boy's name was Stephen White, a name that will forever be associated with the fate of Holland Island. Little Stephen would roam and explore the island while his uncle was at work. As White grew to be a teenager, he quit going to the island. Stephen White returned to the island as an adult and was deeply saddened at how much erosion had occurred during his absence. His memories of how the island once existed were no comparison to what the island was at this time. It was then that he realized something must be done.
From 1990 to 1996, I was doing everything I could to try to see if I could get somebody to do something about the island. Then in 1996, it was like a little voice spoke to me and said, Stephen, if this island has a chance to be saved, you're going to have to do it yourself.
He was so determined to save the island that he actually purchased a piece of land on which the last remaining house was on. From that point on, Mr. White and his wife Diane spent almost every weekend at Holland Island, hauling sandbags, trying to make barriers, and trying as hard as any two people can work to save the island by preventing further erosion. But how he got his inspiration to save this island is a story all its own.
And I saw this grave of Annie McNamara Wilson, 25 years old when she died. And on the ground was a headstone, and it was her daughter's headstone, Effie Lee Wilson, born in 1880, died in 1893. And her epitaph reads, "Forget me not is all I ask. I could not ask for more. That to be cherished by my friends, so loving and so dear. Dearest Effie, thou hast left us, and our loss we deeply feel. But 'tis God that has bereft us. He will all our sorrows heal." And I knew that I had to do, I knew I had to do everything I could, because she's begging not to be forgotten. And she had been forgotten.
Mr. White did not have the resources, nor the money to do this alone. But whenever he tried to get assistance from the government, it was denied. Great debate went on regarding how bad the erosion was, and how all Chesapeake Islands could come to the same dismal fate, and what could be done to stop it. The state spent millions of dollars on tests for the Chesapeake, yet one could argue, it is fair to say, almost absolutely nothing was done to save the island and the bay. All the while, Mr. White was waiting for somebody to help. That somebody never came. By 2009, the last remaining house on Holland Island was all but a few yards from the shore, beaten by wind and tides. Mr. White knew that if actions were not taken immediately, the last remaining house on Holland Island would no longer exist. In June of 2010, the man who had been a diplomat for the island for so many years fell ill. The house stood alone, with no one there to fight against the tides and wind to save it. In October of 2010, the last remaining house on Holland Island plunged into the waves. For 3 months, the beaten and battered house stuck out of the water and the roof right above the tide. The house was like a small child, struggling to stay above the waves, waiting for someone to save it. But Mr. White knew it was too late. In January of 2011, Mr. White and his nephew rode on their boat to the house. Stephen and his nephew covered the house with fuel, struck a match, and set it aflame. But the fight is all but over for Mr. White, who is slowly but surely recovering from leukemia. Mr. White says even though he is not physically working on the island, his heart is still in it being saved. Because funds are desperately low, nothing is currently being done to save Holland Island. Unheard of, secluded, desolate, and only populated by wildlife, Holland Island is now just a faded and forgotten relic in the middle of the Chesapeake. 2 cemeteries remain on Holland Island, one of which is in a marsh that is often flooded, and only bricks remain of the foundations of the houses that once lined the West Ridge. Well, now you know that there was an island called Holland Island, and a man named Stephen White tried to save it. And there was a little girl named Effie Lee Wilson, who didn't want to be forgotten when she died, but was.